Hey everybody, welcome to another Intro to Java programming video. In this video we're going to look at an existing program that uses a string array. It also uses an array initializer, and it does things with a little bit better form than the array basics video that you've already watched. If you haven't watched the array basics video, you need to go back and watch that so you can get a good idea of all the basics that I'm going to cover in this video that I'm not going to cover in detail. All right, let's get right into it. I'm going to run this program so you can see what it is. And you can see it prints out a series of names here to this graphics context. Let's take a look at the structure of the program. All right, the class is called runStringArray1, and it is a JFrame. If you scroll down to line 40, you're going to see that it's got an inner class called StringArray1. And it is that is a JPanel, and it's going to do all that stuff that we would normally do, where we would have the paint component. You've got this call to the super, which is necessary. And then I've got a method that I call drawNames, and it does a traversal and then does a drawString on all of the names in the array. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so you can see that this class is a JFrame, and it uses the inner class. So here's the variable for the inner class. Remember, the inner class is called StringArray1. I just called it SP. And then I've got an array of strings called names, and then I've got a constant here called numNames, and I've made that constant hold the value 10. Okay? All right. In my main method, I'm doing all the stuff that I normally do in a main method. I'm instantiating an object of this class onto itself in the main, like always. I'm setting the preferred size to 400 by 150 in this case. I might go all the way up to 350 or something like that. Doesn't really matter. I've got a method called Initialized Data and another method called SetUpGUI. I'll take a look at those in a minute because those are methods that I created specifically for this project. And then setDefaultClose operation, pack, and setVisibleTrue. Let's first look at the Initialized Data method. This is a method that I've been creating now for a few units. You've been seeing me do this, and I usually make this method when I have a whole bunch of variables that I need to assign values to. Okay, and in this case what I'm doing is I'm going to instantiate my array, and I'm going to assign values into the indices of that array. So here's instantiation. This is super important. Now, in array basics, we took a look at this, and we would declare and instantiate right next to each other. Well, in other programs, you might need to have the array declared as an instance variable, so it's accessible everywhere in the program, accessible in the inner class, accessible in all methods, in the main, whatever, accessible everywhere. And if you do make that an instance variable, you might not be able to initialize all those values up there with an initializer as at the top of the program. You might have to do that in a method. Now, what happens when you do this is you'll be writing code and you're not going to be thinking, and you'll just declare it, and then you'll go down here and you'll just start adding values into it. And you'll forget to do the instantiation. If you forget to instantiate an array before you start adding values into it, you're going to get an error. Let's run this and see what that error looks like. All right, so it says exception in thread main, Java lang null pointer exception. Null pointer exception is one of the most common and most infuriating types of errors that you're going to get. Because sometimes you're not going to know where you need to deal with that. Well, let's look at this error and see how to deal with it. So you've got the stack trace here, and at the top of the stack trace is always going to be where that array or where that error is. So if I click here, it's going to bring me up to the line where that error was thrown. So that error was thrown here at names at 0. So what's it's saying is it's trying to access element 0 of an array where the array doesn't actually exist. It's saying that the names array is currently null. In other words, there's no array in that variable, and I'm trying to work on that array that doesn't exist. So if you ever get that error, you have to look at the thing that is getting the null pointer exception. In this case, it's the array called names. And that tells me that I never instantiated that array. So to instantiate it, I've got to make sure I've got this line. Names gets new string and then some length for the array. Okay? Extremely important. Don't forget that. So when you make an array variable as an instance variable, and then you have to initialize it and add values into it later on, make sure instantiation happens. If not, you'll get a null pointer, and then you'll just have to take a look at where that arises, and then just instantiate that thing that is null. Okay? Right, enough about null pointers. So I instantiated my array, and I made it num names long. We're going to start working in our programs using constants and variables instead of magic numbers throughout this whole set of videos. I introduced this in a previous set of videos, and I want you to get in the habit of doing this at all times. Try to avoid hard coding any values using magic numbers, because magic numbers are make the code much less readable. So num names is currently 10. And I've just made an array that's 10 strings long. And then all I'm doing here is names at 0 getting Charlie, names at 1 Kara, names at 2 Lila, Mace, Strider, and then putting all these different names into that array. So I've put 10 names into that array. Okay? That's initializing. Now let's take a look at setup GUI. Setup GUI is just doing the basic GUI stuff. In this case, all we're doing is we're instantiating an object for our inner class, and then we're adding it to the JFrame. So something that we've been doing since we started working with inner classes a few units ago. And then we're done here with the main method. So let's take a look at the inner class, because this is where the traversal happens, and this is where the drawing happens. I'm going to do something in this in this video that I did on the loops unit, where we use a loop and use the control variable to update the Y so that it'll draw things vertically. So let's look at this. I've got my paint component. Super paint component is called. Don't forget to call super paint component at the top of the paint component. If you forget to do that, things won't work properly most of the time. And then I'm doing my anti-aliasing. This is stuff that we've seen many times before already. And now I'm calling on a method that I created called drawNames. I'm passing G2D into it because the drawNames method needs my graphics in order to do the drawing. So I made a parameter in my drawNames method to take in a graphics 2G so that I can use it in here. So G2D goes into drawNames, and let's take a look at what drawNames does. It's got a traversal loop. It starts at 0. It goes up to names.length, and it just does a standard incrementation, I++. And what's going to happen in that loop is G2D.drawString. So I'm going to draw a string using each of those names. So names at I, that means when I is 0, it's going to get the first one. When I is 1, it'll get the second one. When I is 2, it'll get the third one, all the way up until you get to the length. So if there are 10 in there, it'll do from 0 through 9. But since there's no 10 index, it won't do 10. It's going to draw them all at the x value of 50, and then it's going to draw the y value at y plus I times 15. I mean 1 plus I times 15. The reason I did 1 plus I times 15 is because if it's 0 plus I, it'll be 0 times 15. So the first one will paint at 0, and as you know, 0 will draw that name off the screen. So we don't want to do that. So this is going to be very similar to what we did with the floors of a building. Okay? All right, let's take a look at another type of error that is very common in arrays. They're called off by 1 errors. You might notice that as long as we've been doing loops, I have been initializing my control variable to 0 instead of 1. It seems silly because when we count, we usually count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We don't count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If you're in the habit of starting your loops at 1 and then maybe going up to and including the length, we're going to get 2 off by 1 errors. The first off by 1 error is we're going to miss the first index of the array. I'm just going to run this so you can see what happens. Okay, so nothing draws here, and we've got a big long error. And at the top it says Java lang array index out of bounds exception 10. This is another very common type of error that you're going to get with arrays. In fact, this is probably the most common error that you'll get with arrays. Because what it's saying is that you're trying to access an element of the array that doesn't exist. I'm trying to access index 10 of my array. Now, you might say, hey, well, your array is 10 elements long. There should be an index 10, right? Wrong. Java is 0 indexed. That means the first element is 0, and the last element is length minus 1. So if my length is 10, my last element is 9. So the indices are numbered 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's 10 indices right there. So that would be my first big error that I have. And I can fix that with my traversal loop. My traversal loop right here, if I take this equals off of here, it'll fix that. This is why you never see me making loops that go I less than or equal to something. It's always going to be I less than something, because that gets me in the habit of not getting those index out of bounds exceptions. Okay, let's think about why that is. If names.length is 10, and we are at I is 10, 10 is still equal to 10. That means it gets into the loop. If it tries to access names at 10, that's an error because there's no index 10. Let's think about why this works. We talked about this in the first video. I is 9, we can get in because 9 is less than 10. If names.length is 10, if I is 9, 9 is less than 10, we can get in the loop. Then I increments to 10. 10 is not less than 10, or names.length being 10. I is 10 is not less than that 10, so we cannot get in. It would stop when we get to 10. So that's a little bit about that basic off by 1 error giving you the index out of bounds. Now we still have an off by 1 error. If I run this, you're going to see it's not going to access the first element. The first thing to draw here is Karin, but if you look at element 0, it's Charlie. So it missed the first element in the array. Well, you might say, well, I started at 1, that should be the first element, right? Wrong. The first element in an array is always 0. Java has its arrays indexed 0. So your traversals always start at 0 and go up to and not including the length. All right, so there's a little bit of a fully fleshed out program that uses arrays and strings to do something very simple. In the next video, we're going to go into something more complex. We're going to take a look at making arrays filled with buttons and radio buttons, and then working with those arrays in parallel with string arrays. It's pretty cool, so tune in.